Number 1. John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown who buried his victims beneath his own home. There are crimes that shake a community, and then there are crimes so monstrous, so deeply embedded in the fabric of ordinary suburban life, that they permanently alter the way an entire nation thinks about the people living next door. John Wayne Gacy sits at the very apex of that terrifying category, a man who managed to construct two completely separate realities simultaneously. One in which he was a beloved community figure, a hardworking contractor, a Democratic Party precinct captain, a man who dressed as Pogo the Clown to entertain sick children at hospitals, and another in which he was one of the most prolific and sadistic serial killers the United States had ever produced. The story of John Wayne Gacy is not simply a story about murder. It is a story about the masks that human beings are capable of wearing, about the systemic failures that allowed a predator to operate freely for years, and about the unimaginable suffering of 33 young men and boys whose lives were extinguished in the crawl space beneath a perfectly ordinary house in Norwood Park Township, just outside Chicago, Illinois. To understand how Gacy became what he became, it is necessary to go back to the beginning, to understand the man before the monster, or perhaps more accurately, to understand how the monster was always there, hiding in plain sight. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, the second of 3 children born to John Stanley Gacy and Marion Elaine Robinson. From his earliest years, Gacy's relationship with his father was defined by abuse, humiliation, and an impossible standard of masculinity that the young boy could never seem to meet. His father, a World War I veteran with a violent temper and a serious drinking problem, regularly beat his son, called him a sissy, and expressed open contempt for the boy's perceived weakness. These beatings were not occasional lapses in parental judgment. They were systematic, cruel, and deeply psychologically damaging. Gacy would later describe his father as the greatest influence on his life, and the tragedy is that this was probably true, though not in the way a son should be influenced by a father. Despite the abuse at home, the young Gacy was by many external accounts a pleasant, sociable child who worked hard to win the approval of adults and authority figures around him. He was active in his church, worked part-time jobs from an early age, and demonstrated a talent for salesmanship and social manipulation that would serve him, and ultimately doom his victims, throughout his adult life. He suffered from a heart condition as a child that kept him from participating in certain physical activities, which further alienated him from his father's expectations. In his teenage years, Gacy became aware of same-sex attraction, a reality he would spend the rest of his life desperately suppressing, denying, and ultimately channeling into violence. In the social and religious context of his upbringing, homosexuality was not merely taboo. It was something to be ashamed of at the deepest possible level, and Gacy internalized that shame so completely that it became a central engine of his eventual crimes. After completing high school, Gacy worked various jobs and eventually enrolled in Northwestern Business College. He moved to Springfield, Illinois, where he worked as a shoe salesman, and it was during this period that he began to demonstrate the extraordinary salesmanship abilities that would later make him a successful contractor. In 1964, he married Marlon Myers, whose father owned a chain of Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa. The couple moved to Waterloo, where Gacy managed one of the restaurants, and by most outward appearances, they were living the American dream. A young couple, 2 children, a successful business, and a husband who was deeply involved in the local JC's chapter, eventually rising to the rank of vice president. But beneath this surface of domestic normalcy, something deeply wrong was festering. In 1967, Gacy committed his first known sexual assault, luring a 15-year-old boy into his office, showing him pornographic films, and attempting to perform oral sex on him. When the boy told his father, Gacy attempted to hire someone to intimidate the witness, a plan that failed spectacularly when the would-be intimidator reported Gacy to the police. Gacy was charged with sodomy in May of 1968, and in a move that would set a terrible precedent for the future, He managed to charm and manipulate those around him so effectively that many in the community refused to believe the charges. He was ultimately convicted and sentenced to 10 years in the Iowa State Reformatory at Anamosa, but he was such a model prisoner, so cooperative, so industrious, so seemingly remorseful, that he was paroled after just 18 months. His wife divorced him while he was incarcerated, taking their children with her, and Gacy moved back to Chicago, where he moved in with his mother and began rebuilding his life, or rather, began constructing the next phase of his double existence. In Chicago, Gacy threw himself into work with remarkable energy. He started a contracting company called PDM Contractors, which specialized in remodeling projects, and the business quickly became successful. He bought a house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue in the unincorporated Norwood Park Township, a quiet, respectable neighborhood where neighbors left their doors unlocked and children played freely in the streets. He remarried in 1972, this time to a divorcee named Carol Hoff, who moved in with her 2 daughters. He became deeply involved in local Democratic Party politics, eventually earning the title of precinct captain. He organized elaborate neighborhood parties for hundreds of guests, barbecues and block parties where politicians, police officers, and community leaders mingled freely in his backyard. And he began performing as Pogo the Clown and Patches the Clown at children's hospitals and charitable events, the face-painted, bright-costumed figure becoming one of his most effective and devastating disguises. The first known murder attributed to John Wayne Gacy in this period occurred on January 2, 1972, when he picked up a young man named Timothy McCoy at the Greyhound bus terminal in Chicago, brought him home, and stabbed him to death. Gacy would later claim that the killing was accidental, a claim that even the most charitable reading of the evidence renders absurd. Over the following years, the murders continued at an escalating pace, the victims almost all young men and teenage boys who were lured to Gacy's home with promises of work, money, or simply the hospitality of a friendly adult. His method was consistent and horrifying. He would offer his victims alcohol or drugs, often showing them a rope trick that ended with them handcuffed or restrained, and then he would torture, sexually assault, and strangle them, usually using a tourniquet method he called the rope trick. The bodies were buried in the crawl space beneath his house, a dark, cramped, soil-floored space that Gacy periodically treated with lime to accelerate decomposition and mask the smell. His second wife, Carol, noticed the persistent and unpleasant odor that seemed to emanate from the house, but accepted Gacy's explanations about moisture and drainage problems. She also noticed that young men would sometimes arrive at the house late at night and would not be there in the morning, but again accepted explanations, or perhaps chose not to examine too closely the reality that was right beneath her feet, literally. The marriage ended in 1976, with Carol Hoff later stating that Gacy had told her he preferred men, a confession that in retrospect takes on a dimension of horror she could not have fully understood at the time. With his wife gone, Gacy's killings accelerated dramatically. He had already disposed of several victims in the Des Plaines River when the crawl space began to fill, and he continued to use both methods as the body count climbed. His victims came from all walks of life: runaways, young men looking for construction work, teenagers from Chicago's North Side, boys who had encountered the friendly, gregarious contractor and seen nothing to fear. Among them was 15-year-old John Butkovich, who disappeared in July of 1975 after a dispute with Gacy over back wages. Butkovich's parents went to the police multiple times, telling investigators that they believed Gacy was responsible, but Gacy was interviewed and released, charming the investigators as he charmed everyone. There was 19-year-old Gregory Godzik, who worked for Gacy's company and disappeared in December of 1976. There was John Szyc, 19, who disappeared in January of 1977. There was Robert Donnelly, who survived an encounter with Gacy in December of 1977 and reported being tortured over the course of a night, but was not believed by police. The systemic failure here is staggering and infuriating. Gacy was known to investigators, had a prior conviction for sodomy, had been reported by multiple people, and yet continued to operate because he was charming, well-connected, and because the victims, young, often marginalized men, were not treated with the urgency their disappearances demanded. The case that ultimately broke everything open began on December 11, 1978, when 15-year-old Robert Pius disappeared after telling his mother he was going to speak with a contractor about a summer job. The contractor was Gacy. Pius' mother reported him missing immediately, and crucially, because Pius was a young, white, suburban teenager from a stable family, the disappearance was taken seriously almost immediately. Des Plaines Police Lieutenant Joseph Kozenzak pursued the case aggressively, quickly establishing that Pius had been seen speaking with Gacy at a pharmacy where Pius worked. When investigators ran a background check on Gacy, they discovered his 1968 sodomy conviction in Iowa, a fact that hardened their suspicion considerably. Gacy was interviewed and denied any knowledge of Pius' whereabouts, but investigators obtained a search warrant for his home. The first search on December 13, 1978, did not immediately reveal the bodies, but detectives noticed the foul smell and found items belonging to previous victims. Gacy was placed under surveillance, and while being followed by investigators, he made incriminating statements and behaved in ways that deepened suspicion. On December 21, 1978, investigators obtained a second search warrant, and this time they found what they were looking for. A detective crawling through the crawl space with a flashlight encountered human remains, and within days, it became clear that the house on Summerdale Avenue was the site of a mass grave of almost unimaginable proportions. Gacy was arrested on December 21, 1978, and over the following weeks, the full horror of what lay beneath his home was excavated. Investigators eventually recovered 26 bodies from the crawl space, and 4 more victims were identified as having been thrown from bridges into the Des Plaines and Illinois rivers. Gacy initially attempted to blame the murders on a business associate and employee named Jack Hanley, a fictional figure he invented during his interrogations. When this story collapsed, he tried various other approaches, including claiming that an alter ego named Bad Jack had committed the murders while Gacy himself was unaware. These claims of diminished capacity and alternate personality would form the core of his legal defense, but they convinced almost no one. The trial of John Wayne Gacy began on February 6, 1980, in Chicago, and it was one of the most sensational criminal proceedings in American history up to that point. The prosecution, led by Assistant State's Attorney William Kunkel, methodically presented the evidence: the physical remains, the forensic testimony, the testimony of survivors who had escaped Gacy's clutches and described their ordeals in harrowing detail, and the testimony of investigators who described the crime scene in terms that left the courtroom shaken. The defense, led by Sam Amarant and Robert Mata, argued that Gacy suffered from multiple personality disorder and was legally insane at the time of the murders. They brought in psychiatrists who testified about Gacy's psychological state, his troubled childhood, and the dissociative episodes they claimed explained the crimes. The prosecution countered with their own psychiatric experts who argued that Gacy was fully aware of his actions, had taken careful steps to avoid detection, and was legally sane by any applicable standard. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all 33 counts of murder. It remains one of the fastest verdicts in a major capital murder case in Illinois history, a reflection of how overwhelming the evidence was and how completely the defense's insanity argument had failed to persuade. Gacy was sentenced to death on 12 of the murder counts and to natural life in prison on the remaining 21. He spent 14 years on death row at the Menard Correctional Center, during which time he became, improbably and grotesquely, something of a folk figure. He painted, and his clown paintings, images of Pogo that he created from his cell, were bought by collectors and displayed in galleries, a fact that horrified victims' families and raised profound questions about the commodification of evil. He gave interviews, corresponded with journalists and true crime enthusiasts, and continued to assert, even in the face of his own confessions, that some of his victims had died accidentally or that he could not remember all of the details of the crimes. He was executed by lethal injection on May 10, 1994, at the Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill, Illinois. His last meal was a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken, a detail that seemed almost too darkly symbolic to be real but was entirely true. In the years following his execution, investigators continued to work to identify all of his victims. For decades, 8 of the recovered bodies remained unidentified, known only by numbers assigned during the investigation. Through advances in DNA technology and forensic genealogy, identifications continued to be made well into the 21st century, each one bringing a measure of resolution to families who had spent decades not knowing what had happened to their sons and brothers. The legacy of John Wayne Gacy extends far beyond the terrible arithmetic of his victim count. His case exposed catastrophic failures in how law enforcement tracked sex offenders, how missing persons reports involving marginalized young men were handled, and how effectively a charming and socially prominent individual could exploit community trust to conceal monstrous crimes. It led directly to changes in Illinois law regarding the registration and monitoring of convicted sex offenders, and it contributed to the national conversation about predatory behavior, victim advocacy, and the importance of taking seriously the reports of those who survived and tried to report abuse. The house on Summerdale Avenue was demolished in 1979, and a new house was built on the lot, but the address was changed, the physical structure was gone, but the memory of what happened there has never faded, and for the families of 33 young men, it never will. Number 2. H. Holmes, America's first documented serial killer and the monster of the White City. If John Wayne Gacy represents the horror of the late 20th century's suburban nightmare, then Herman Webster Mudgett, known to history as H. Holmes, represents something even more chilling: the possibility that the serial killer as a fully realized, methodically operating phenomenon is not a modern invention but an ancient human capacity that found its most theatrical and documented expression in the gilded chaos of one of the most celebrated events in American history. Holmes operated in Chicago in the early 1890s, during the years surrounding the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, and the convergence of his crimes with that grand spectacle of human achievement and optimism gave his story a literary quality that has made it one of the most enduring true crime narratives in American history. But strip away the Gothic architecture and the romantic tragedy of the era, and what remains is a story of calculated, cold-blooded murder committed by a man who appears to have felt no more remorse killing a human being than most people feel swatting a fly. Herman Webster Mudgett was born on May 16, 1861, in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, to a respectable Methodist family. From his earliest years, he demonstrated intelligence that bordered on brilliance and a capacity for deception that would define every relationship he ever formed. As a child, he was reportedly fascinated with surgery and anatomy, and there are accounts, though some have been disputed, that he was exposed to human skeletons by bullying classmates who forced him into the office of a local doctor, an experience that, rather than terrifying him, appears to have awakened something in him. He attended the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery, where he received his medical degree in 1884, and it was during his time as a medical student that he first began to engage in the fraudulent and criminal behaviors that would escalate into murder. He stole cadavers from the university's laboratories, used them to stage insurance fraud schemes, and demonstrated an extraordinary coolness when confronted with the kind of moral and physical horror that would paralyze most people. After completing his medical degree, Mudgett adopted the name Henry Howard Holmes and began moving from city to city, town to town, leaving behind a trail of fraud, bigamy, and increasingly suspicious circumstances. He worked as a pharmacist in various locations, presented himself as a physician, charmed employers and business partners, borrowed money he never repaid, and moved on before consequences could catch him. He married at least 3 women simultaneously. He was a bigamist multiple times over, and demonstrated a particular talent for winning the trust and affection of women and then exploiting them financially and, as his crimes escalated, physically. He arrived in Chicago in the late 1880s, eventually settling in the Englewood neighborhood, where he took a job at a pharmacy and then, with breathtaking audacity, began acquiring the property adjacent to the pharmacy with the intention of constructing a building that he designed himself and that would serve, in ways that his neighbors and investors could not possibly have imagined, as his primary instrument of murder. The building Holmes constructed at the corner of South Wallace Avenue and West 63rd Street became known after his arrest as the Murder Castle, a name that captures something essential about its nature. It was a 3-story, mixed-use building that on its upper floors contained a hotel with about 100 rooms, a feature that made it ideally situated to receive the hundreds of thousands of visitors who would flock to Chicago for the 1893 World's Fair. But Holmes had designed the building with features that served no purpose a legitimate hotel owner would require. There were rooms that could be sealed airtight, connected to gas lines that Holmes controlled from a central panel. There were chutes that led directly to the basement, where Holmes had installed a kiln large enough to cremate a human body and acid vats capable of dissolving flesh and bone. There were hidden passages, false walls, rooms that could only be opened from the outside, and a surgical table equipped with straps. Holmes employed multiple contractors to build different sections of the building, firing each crew before they could comprehend the full picture of what was being constructed, then refusing to pay them and using the resulting legal confusion to delay any accounting for the building's peculiarities. He was constantly in debt, constantly juggling creditors, constantly spinning new schemes, but the building rose and was eventually completed in time to receive guests for the World's Fair. Among the many people who passed through Holmes's hotel and his various business enterprises during the fair years were the women who became his victims. He was extraordinarily attractive to women. Charming, attentive, well-dressed, educated, seemingly stable and successful, and he exploited this attraction with ruthless calculation. He would hire women as secretaries or assistants, begin romantic relationships with them, convince them to make him the beneficiary of their life insurance policies or to sign over their assets, and then kill them. Among his documented victims were Julia Smythe, the wife of his pharmacy manager, whom Holmes began an affair with and eventually killed along with her daughter Pearl. There was Emmeline Sigrand, a young woman from Indiana who came to work as his secretary and was never seen again. There was Minnie Williams, a Texas heiress whose trust Holmes cultivated with extraordinary patience, eventually inheriting her property and then killing her sister Nanny as well. The precise number of Holmes's victims has been debated by historians and investigators for more than a century, and the estimates have ranged from 9 to as many as 250, a figure that most serious historians regard as almost certainly inflated by the sensationalist journalism of the era. The most carefully documented scholarly analyses suggest a confirmed or highly probable victim count in the range of 9 to 27. Which is itself a staggering number and does nothing to diminish the horror of what Holmes did. What is clear is that Holmes killed with variety and apparent flexibility. He gassed victims in his sealed rooms, he strangled, he used his surgical skills on bodies after death in ways that suggested a deep and disturbing personal interest in the physical mechanics of death and decomposition, and he used the crematorium and acid vats in his basement to destroy evidence with clinical efficiency. The investigation that ultimately brought Holmes to justice had nothing to do with his Chicago murders, a fact that speaks volumes about how effectively he concealed his crimes and how ill-equipped law enforcement of the era was to recognize and respond to the kind of organized, systematic predation Holmes practiced. His downfall began with an insurance fraud scheme he conducted in Texas and Philadelphia involving a man named Benjamin Pittazel, a former associate whom Holmes persuaded to fake his own death so that Holmes could collect on a life insurance policy. The scheme unraveled when Holmes actually killed Pittazel rather than arranging a fake death, then killed 3 of Pittazel's children while their mother was kept separated from them and fed false information. Philadelphia detective Frank Geyer pursued Holmes across multiple states, following the trail of the missing Pittizel children and eventually finding their bodies in a house Holmes had rented in Toronto. Holmes was arrested in November of 1894, initially on charges related to the insurance fraud, and it was during the investigation of those charges that detectives began to examine his Chicago building and discovered what it contained. The excavation of the murder castle's basement in the summer of 1895, conducted by a team of Philadelphia detectives and reported on breathlessly by newspapers across the country, produced evidence of an almost incomprehensible crime scene. Human bones, including those of children, fragments of clothing, the crematorium with its bone fragments and traces of ash, the acid vats, the surgical equipment. The investigation was technically challenging because Holmes had been so methodical in destroying evidence, and because the building had changed hands and been partially altered in the period between Holmes's departure and the investigation. Holmes was tried not for his Chicago murders but for the murder of Benjamin Pittizel in Philadelphia, a strategic decision by prosecutors who recognized that the Pennsylvania case had the clearest evidence and the most straightforward path to conviction. The trial lasted less than a week, and Holmes was convicted on November 2, 1895. He was sentenced to death and executed by hanging on May 7, 1896, at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia. In a final demonstration of the paranoia and self-mythologizing that had defined his life, Holmes requested that he be buried in concrete so that his body could not be exhumed and studied after his death, a request that was honored and that has, along with the continuing historical debate about his victim count, kept the questions surrounding his case open for more than a century. Holmes's significance in the history of American crime is difficult to overstate. He was not the first American to commit multiple murders, but the documentation of his case, the scale of his premeditation, and the systematic nature of his operation established a template for understanding what we would come to call serial killing that preceded the formal development of the concept by nearly a century. Eric Larson's 2003 book, The Devil in the White City, brought Holmes's story to a new generation of readers and sparked a renewed scholarly and popular interest in the case that has continued to grow, including a long-running effort to produce a film or television adaptation that has attracted the interest of major filmmakers and studios. The story of H.H. Holmes remains uniquely disturbing not simply because of the crimes themselves but because of the context in which they were committed, the World's Fair, that celebration of human progress and achievement that drew millions to Chicago with the promise of wonder and possibility. Holmes saw those millions not as people but as opportunities, and the contrast between the idealism of the fair and the darkness beneath his building on 63rd Street stands as one of the most powerful and unsettling juxtapositions in American history. Number 3. Richard Speck. The Night of Terror that claimed 8 nurses and changed Chicago forever. There are nights that become permanent entries in the collective memory of a city, nights so brutal and so sudden that they divide time into before and after, and for Chicago, July 13th and 14th of 1966 constitute one of those nights. In the span of a few terrible hours, a drifter and petty criminal named Richard Franklin Speck entered a townhouse on East 100th Street in Chicago's South Side that served as a dormitory for student nurses at the South Chicago Community Hospital. And by the time morning came, 8 young women were dead and the city of Chicago, and the entire nation, was confronting a species of violence so senseless, so massive in its sudden devastation, that it forced a fundamental reconsideration of the nature of random violent crime in America. Richard Speck was born on December 6, 1941, in Kirkwood, Illinois, and his early life was characterized by the kind of instability, abuse, and social failure that appears repeatedly in the biographies of violent offenders, though it is important to note that these factors explain something about his development without in any way excusing what he ultimately became. His father died when Speck was 6, and his mother remarried a man named Carl Lindbergh, an alcoholic with a violent temper and multiple criminal convictions who subjected the family to an environment of chaos and intimidation. The family moved to Dallas, Texas, where Speck grew up, and it was there that his descent into criminal behavior began in earnest. By his teenage years, he was drinking heavily, had accumulated dozens of arrests for crimes ranging from disorderly conduct to burglary, and had demonstrated a particular hostility toward women that would appear repeatedly in his criminal record and in the accounts of those who knew him. He married briefly in 1962 and had a daughter, but the marriage ended after repeated incidents of domestic violence and Speck's inability to maintain steady employment or sobriety. He worked various itinerant jobs, spent time in prison in Texas, and drifted from city to city, accumulating a criminal record that included charges of assault, theft, and at least one incident involving a knife attack on a woman that should have resulted in more serious legal consequences than it did. In the months before the murders, Speck had made his way to Chicago, where he had family connections and where he was working sporadically as a laborer and merchant seaman. He was staying at a rooming house and drinking heavily, and in the weeks before July 13th, he made multiple failed attempts to ship out on merchant vessels, each rejection deepening his frustration and instability. He had also, around this time, made a series of threatening and criminal approaches toward women in the Chicago area that, had they been properly investigated and connected, might have provided warning of what was coming. On the night of July 13, 1966, Speck broke into the townhouse at 2319 East 100th Street sometime after 11 o'clock at night. The townhouse was home to 9 student nurses who lived there while completing their training at South Chicago Community Hospital. He was armed with a knife and a gun, and he initially gathered the nurses who were present, 6 women at first, into one bedroom using torn bedsheets to tie their hands. Over the course of the next several hours, as additional nurses returned to the townhouse and were absorbed into Speck's control, he took the women one by one to other parts of the house and killed them, strangling most of them and stabbing several, in what investigators would later describe as a methodical, if not entirely coherent, progression through the house. The 8 women who died that night were Pamela Wilkening, 23, a student nurse from Lansing, Illinois; Mary and Jordan, 20, from Chicago; Suzanne Ferris, 21, from Chicago; Merlita Gargullo, 23, who had come to the United States from the Philippines; Valentina Passion, 23, also from the Philippines; Nina Jo Schmale, 24, from Wheaton, Illinois; Patty Matusek, 20, from Chicago; and Gloria Davy, 22, from Dyer, Indiana, whose death was particularly brutal and who was the last to be killed. There was a 9th woman in the house that night, Corazon Amureo, also from the Philippines, who saved her own life by rolling under a bed and pressing herself against the wall, remaining perfectly still while Speck conducted his murderous progression through the house. It was Corazon Amureo who, when the horror finally ended and she was able to escape through a window and summon help, provided investigators with their first description of the killer and the phrase that would echo through the subsequent investigation: "I am the only one left." The investigation moved with extraordinary speed. Speck had introduced himself to the nurses by name, and Amureo was able to provide a detailed physical description of the killer, including a distinctive tattoo on his arm that read, "Born to Raise Hell." Within days, Chicago police detectives had developed Speck as their primary suspect, and his photograph was being circulated throughout the city and across national media. Speck himself, remarkably, had not fled Chicago. He was drinking in a rooming house on the north side, apparently making little effort to escape, and on July 16th, just 3 days after the murders, he attempted suicide by slashing his wrists and was taken to Cook County Hospital, where a resident physician named Leroy Smith recognized his distinctive tattoo from the description circulating in the media and immediately contacted police. Speck was arrested and charged with 8 counts of murder, and his trial began in April of 1967, having been moved to Peoria due to the impossibility of selecting an impartial jury in Chicago. The trial was, in legal terms, relatively straightforward. The evidence was overwhelming, Corazon Amureo's eyewitness identification was damning, and the physical evidence connecting Speck to the crime scene was extensive. The defense attempted to challenge the identification and raise questions about the handling of evidence, but the jury was not persuaded. Speck was convicted on all 8 counts of murder on April 15, 1967, and sentenced to death in the electric chair on June 5, 1967. It appeared that the case had reached its conclusion, but the legal proceedings were far from over. In 1971, the United States Supreme Court's ruling in Furman v. Georgia effectively invalidated all existing death sentences in the country, commuting them to life imprisonment, and Speck's death sentence was among those commuted. He would never face execution. He remained incarcerated at the Stateville Correctional Center, where, in one of the most disturbing postscripts to an already devastating story, a video recording made inside the prison in the 1980s was leaked to the public in 1996. The footage, which Speck himself apparently helped to make, showed him boasting about the murders, describing how much he had enjoyed killing the nurses, and engaging in behavior that was so profoundly disturbing that its broadcast on television news programs caused a new wave of anguish for the families of his victims. The video remains one of the most chilling documents in the history of American true crime, a window into the psychology of a man who felt no remorse whatsoever and who, protected by the walls of his prison, experienced his crimes as a source of pride rather than shame. Speck died in prison on December 5, 1991, one day before his 50th birthday, of a heart attack. He had been refused parole repeatedly, and it is notable that he died having served only 25 years for the murder of 8 women, a disproportion between crime and consequence that has troubled legal scholars and victim advocates ever since. The impact of the Speck murders on American culture and law enforcement was profound and lasting. The case is widely credited with accelerating the development of what would become criminal profiling as an investigative tool, as law enforcement agencies grappled with how to identify and apprehend individuals capable of this kind of mass, apparently motiveless violence. It contributed to public debate about security in residential facilities, particularly those housing young women, and it had a lasting effect on the nursing profession and on the South Chicago community where the murders occurred. For Corazon Amureo, the sole survivor, the decades after the crime were marked by the courage required to testify, to face Speck in court, and to carry the weight of having survived when her friends and colleagues did not. She eventually returned to the Philippines, married, and built a life, but the night on East 100th Street never fully released her, as she acknowledged in the limited interviews she gave over the years. The 8 women who died, Pamela, Mary, and Suzanne, Merlita, Valentina, Nina, Patty, and Gloria, were at the beginning of careers dedicated to healing and care, and their loss represented not only the devastation of 8 individual lives and the families who loved them, but the loss of everything those women might have become and contributed to the world. Number 4. Gecht and the Ripper Crew, the satanic ring that terrorized Chicago's North Side. Among the most disturbing chapters in the history of organized violent crime in Illinois is the story of a loosely connected group of men, known as the Chicago Rippers or the Ripper Crew, who between 1981 and 1982 committed a series of murders and mutilations in the Chicago area that combined elements of sadistic sexual violence with ritualistic imagery and organized criminality in ways that investigators found almost impossible to comprehend at first encounter. At the center of this group was Robin Gecht, a carpenter who had at one point worked as a subcontractor for John Wayne Gacy, a connection that is as chilling in retrospect as it is unsurprising. And around him orbited 3 other men, Thomas Kokoralius, his brother Andrew Kokoralius, and Edward Spreitzer, each of whom participated in the crimes to varying degrees and with varying levels of personal investment in the violence. The full story of the Ripper Crew is one of the most extreme and disturbing in Illinois true crime history, a story in which the boundaries between organized criminal behavior, sexual sadism, and what prosecutors would describe as a form of ritualized worship of violence were entirely dissolved. Robin Gecht was born in Chicago in 1953, and his early life provided few obvious warning signs of what he would eventually become, though there are, in retrospect, threads that connect his childhood and adolescent experiences to the crimes he orchestrated as an adult. He was by various accounts an intelligent and resourceful individual who could be charming and personable when it served him, and his carpentry and contracting work gave him a veneer of respectable working-class legitimacy. He married and had children, lived in a house in the Roseland neighborhood on Chicago's far south side, and presented to the world the face of an ordinary working man. But beneath that surface, he had developed a set of beliefs and desires that were anything but ordinary, centered on extreme sexual sadism and what investigators would come to describe as a form of devil worship that he used both to organize his own fantasies and to bind the men around him to shared criminal acts. The murders attributed to the Ripper crew began in the spring of 1981 and continued through the fall of 1982. And they followed a pattern that was consistent enough to suggest organization but varied enough to complicate the initial investigation. The group's victims were primarily women, most of them associated with prostitution in the Chicago area, a fact that meant their disappearances were not always immediately reported and were not always treated with the urgency they warranted. The modus operandi involved the use of a van, the vehicle that would become central to the mythology of the case, in which Gecht and one or more of the other men would cruise areas where women were working as prostitutes, offer them money for sexual services, and then overpower them. The violence that followed was extreme and ritualistic, involving the amputation of a breast, which investigators later learned Gecht and the others consumed in what Gecht described as a satanic communion. The women were then killed, some by strangulation, and their bodies disposed of in various locations around the Chicago area. The investigation of these crimes was complicated by multiple factors, including the victimology. The women involved in prostitution were among the most vulnerable and least socially visible victims imaginable, and by the absence initially of any single, identifiable signature that would connect the individual cases to a single perpetrator or group. It was only over time, as the cases accumulated and investigators began to see the pattern in the injuries, that the possibility of a connected series began to emerge. The breakthrough came not through the investigation of a murder but through the survival of a victim who managed to escape. In October of 1982, a woman named Beverly Washington was found alive in Chicago's West Side, having suffered extreme injuries consistent with the pattern investigators had begun to identify in the murders. Her survival and the information she was eventually able to provide gave investigators the first concrete lead that broke the case open. A separate investigation into the activities of Edward Spreitzer and Andrew Kokoralius for an unrelated assault produced information that connected them to the Ripper crew murders. And once investigators had one thread to pull, the entire network began to unravel. Gecht, Spreitzer, and the Kokoralius brothers were all arrested in late 1982. What followed was a complex series of legal proceedings that extended over several years and produced dramatically different outcomes for the four men involved, differences that reflected both the varying degrees of their individual participation in the crimes and the different quality of evidence available against each. Thomas Kokoralius pleaded guilty to one murder and received a 40-year sentence. Andrew Kokoralius was convicted of murder and sentenced to death, and he became the last person to be executed in Illinois before the state instituted a moratorium on executions, dying by lethal injection on March 17, 1999. Edward Spreitzer was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death, a sentence that was later commuted to life in prison when Illinois abolished the death penalty in 2011. Robin Gecht, the ringleader, was convicted not of the murders themselves. The evidence directly connecting him to the killings, while strong in the view of many investigators, proved more difficult to prosecute to a murder conviction, but of aggravated battery and attempted murder in connection with the attack on Beverly Washington. He was sentenced to 120 years in prison, a sentence that ensured he would never be free, but the fact that the man investigators regarded as the architect of the entire enterprise was never convicted of murder has remained a source of profound frustration for investigators, prosecutors, and the families of victims. The Ripper crew case raised disturbing questions about the nature of group violence and the dynamics by which ordinary men, men with families and jobs and some degree of social integration, can be organized around shared criminal and sadistic impulses. The role of Gecht as a charismatic and dominating figure who recruited, organized, and directed the others is a subject that has attracted considerable attention from criminologists and psychologists studying the phenomenon of organized sexual violence. The case also highlighted, once again, the profound vulnerability of women working in prostitution and the systemic failure of law enforcement to treat their disappearances and deaths with the urgency and resources devoted to crimes against more socially visible victims. A failure that is not unique to this case, but that is particularly stark when measured against the number of women who were killed before the investigation gained traction. Number 5. Herb Baumeister, the suburban killer whose victims disappeared into his Fox Hollow farm. While Herb Baumeister is primarily associated with Indiana, where he owned the Fox Hollow farm property that became the site of one of the most disturbing discoveries in Midwestern crime history, the full scope of his crimes as investigated by law enforcement connected him to victims from Illinois and established that the Interstate 70 corridor running through Indiana and Illinois had been a hunting ground for a man whose ability to conceal his true nature was, in the judgment of the investigators who pursued him, arguably even more sophisticated than Gacy's. Baumeister was born on April 7, 1947, in Indianapolis, Indiana, and his childhood and early adult life presented a picture of disturbing psychological instability that was nonetheless never sufficiently addressed by the medical and social systems that encountered it. He was reportedly diagnosed with mental illness at a young age, exhibited highly inappropriate behaviors in school and socially, and struggled throughout his life with a psychological landscape that those who knew him best described as deeply fractured. Despite these difficulties, he managed to marry, father 3 children, and build a successful business, a chain of thrift stores called Save-A-Lot that provided a comfortable upper-middle-class lifestyle and a respectable social identity. The family lived on a large estate in Hamilton County, Indiana, called Fox Hollow Farm, 18 acres of wooded property that would later reveal its terrible secrets. Throughout the late 1980s and into the 1990s, a series of gay men began disappearing from Indianapolis and from gay bars along the I-70 corridor in Indiana and Illinois. The men were typically last seen leaving bars with an older, well-dressed man who drove an expensive car, and in some cases witnesses were able to describe conversations in which the man offered to demonstrate autoerotic asphyxiation, which investigators would later identify as Baumeister's method of killing. Despite the disappearances and some investigative attention, Baumeister's name did not immediately come to the surface, in part because his social identity, married businessman, father, respectable community member, seemed to investigators to be inconsistent with the profile they were developing, and in part because the investigation of crimes involving gay victims in this era was not always pursued with the full resources of the departments involved. The case began to break open in 1994 when a boy who had been visiting Fox Hollow Farm found a human skull while playing on the property and brought it inside, a discovery that Baumeister's wife, Julie, initially did not take seriously enough to report, accepting her husband's explanation that it was a medical specimen. It was only when Julie Baumeister sought help from investigators in 1996, after her marriage had begun to collapse and she had grown deeply suspicious of her husband's activities, that the skull and the property were formally examined. What investigators found when they searched the Fox Hollow Farm property in the summer of 1996 was staggering. The skeletal remains of 11 individuals were recovered from the grounds, and subsequent forensic analysis confirmed that the bones represented multiple homicide victims. By the time investigators were ready to arrest Baumeister, he had fled to Canada, where he killed himself in a provincial park in Ontario on July 3, 1996, leaving behind a suicide note that addressed his business failures and his marriage but said nothing about the murders, a silence that has left investigators and victims' families without the full accounting they sought. The confirmed victim count attributed to Baumeister was 11, but investigators working the I-70 case believed he was responsible for as many as 16 additional disappearances from the corridor, a total that would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in Midwestern history. The Illinois connection in the Baumeister case is significant because several of the men who disappeared from the I-70 corridor were from Illinois, and the investigation required cooperation between Indiana and Illinois law enforcement agencies that was not always smooth or effective, a jurisdictional challenge that likely allowed Baumeister to continue operating longer than he should have. Number 6. Larry Eyler, the highway killer who left a trail of bodies across Illinois and Indiana. Larry Eyler is perhaps less famous than some of the killers on this list, but the scale and geography of his crimes, and the extraordinary story of how a legal system error allowed him to walk free after his first arrest only for him to kill again, make his case one of the most disturbing and infuriating in Illinois criminal history. Eyler was born on December 21, 1952, in Crawfordsville, Indiana, and his early life was marked by trauma, instability, and a profound confusion about his own identity that he never successfully resolved. He was raised largely by his mother after his parents divorced, experienced what he would later describe as sexual abuse, and struggled throughout his adolescence and early adulthood with his homosexuality in an environment and era that offered him no support or framework for understanding it. He worked various jobs, lived in the Chicago area for much of his adult life, and maintained a relationship with a man named Robert Little, a university professor who would become deeply entangled in the subsequent investigation. Between 1982 and 1984, a series of young men began appearing dead along highways and in rural areas in Illinois and Indiana, their bodies bearing signs of extreme violence, stabbing wounds, signs of bondage, and in many cases evidence of sadistic post-mortem mutilation. The victims were typically young men, many of them involved in the gay subculture of Chicago's North Side or of small Indiana cities, and the pattern of the crimes, the rural dumping sites, the highway connections, the consistent wound patterns, suggested to investigators a single offender who was mobile, organized, and deeply familiar with the interstate highway system that connected Illinois and Indiana. The investigation that developed around these cases involved a multi-agency task force that struggled with jurisdictional tensions and with the challenge of connecting crimes committed in multiple counties across 2 states. Eyler came to the attention of investigators through a combination of witness statements from the gay bars where several of the victims had last been seen and through his own movements, which placed him at or near multiple crime scenes. He was placed under surveillance, and in September of 1983, Indiana State Police investigators stopped him on a rural road after observing him with a young man who had blood on his clothing. The stop produced evidence, bloody clothing, knives, rope, that investigators believed was directly connected to the murders, and Eyler was arrested. But in a ruling that would have devastating consequences, a judge determined that the evidence had been obtained in violation of Eyler's Fourth Amendment rights and ordered it suppressed. Without the physical evidence, prosecutors could not sustain the charges, and Eyler was released in November of 1983. Within weeks of his release, he killed again. The murder that finally ended Eyler's freedom came in August of 1984, when the dismembered body of 15-year-old Daniel Bridges was found in garbage bags in the dumpster of Eyler's Chicago apartment building. This time, there were no procedural obstacles. The evidence was clear and unambiguous, and Eyler was arrested and charged with murder. He was convicted of the murder of Daniel Bridges in 1986 and sentenced to death. Facing execution, Eyler made a decision that shocked and horrified many. He offered to provide information about the full scope of his crimes in exchange for consideration for his attorney. Through his attorney, he eventually confessed to 21 murders committed across Illinois and Indiana, and he provided details that allowed investigators to close numerous open cases. The confessions were detailed and harrowing, describing crimes committed with a level of sadistic planning that suggested Eyler had been fantasizing about and rehearsing this type of violence for years before he first acted on it. Eyler died in prison on March 6, 1994, of complications from AIDS, before his death sentence could be carried out. His case remains a powerful and painful illustration of the cost of procedural errors in the investigation of serial crimes. The judge's ruling that suppressed the evidence from the 1983 stop was legally defensible, but its consequence was to return a man already deeply engaged in serial murder to freedom, where he continued to kill. For the families of those additional victims, the question of what might have been had the evidence been handled differently is one that has no satisfying answer. Number 7. John Edward Robinson, the first internet serial killer with deep Illinois roots. John Edward Robinson occupies a unique and deeply unsettling position in the history of American serial crime. He is widely regarded by law enforcement and criminologists as the first known serial killer to use the internet as a tool for identifying, grooming, and ultimately luring victims, a distinction that places him at the intersection of the ancient phenomenon of predatory violence and the new digital landscape of the late 20th century. But Robinson's story did not begin with the internet, and his criminal history long predated his online activities, rooted in Illinois in a career of fraud, exploitation, and manipulation that spanned decades before his murders were discovered. Robinson was born on December 27, 1943, in Cicero, Illinois, a Chicago suburb, and his early life presented the same paradox of surface respectability and underlying depravity that appears so often in the biographies of organized serial killers. He was, by various accounts, a charming and ambitious young man who could project an image of success and competence while systematically deceiving everyone around him. He became an Eagle Scout, a distinction he referred to throughout his life as evidence of his character. He pursued a medical career but never completed his training, instead building a career based largely on fraudulent credentials and misrepresentation. He married in 1964 and eventually had 4 children, and he presented himself throughout his professional life as a successful businessman and community figure. Between the 1960s and the 1980s, Robinson was repeatedly investigated and convicted of various fraud offenses in Kansas and Missouri, where he eventually settled after leaving Illinois, but he always managed to avoid serious prison time, partly through manipulation of the legal system and partly through the same charm and surface plausibility that he would later deploy in his online predation. He began killing in the 1980s, targeting women who were in vulnerable situations, women seeking employment or housing, women in abusive relationships who were looking for escape, and eventually women who had infants that Robinson would then place with adoptive families through fraudulent processes, collecting fees from the adoptive parents. His method evolved over time, and by the 1990s, when the internet provided new avenues for finding victims, he had refined his approach to a degree that was both impressive in its organization and horrifying in its implications. Robinson used early internet chat rooms and BDSM community forums to present himself as a wealthy, sophisticated dominant who could offer submissive women the lifestyle and relationship dynamic they sought. He was extraordinarily patient and skilled in online communication, spending weeks or months developing relationships before convincing women to meet him in person, and once they met, they typically disappeared. The investigation that eventually caught Robinson began in 1999, when women he was corresponding with online began contacting each other and comparing their experiences with the man who called himself Slave Master. The information they assembled and brought to law enforcement, combined with a separate investigation into Robinson's fraudulent business activities, led to a search of properties he owned in Kansas and Missouri, which produced the bodies of 8 women stored in barrels. Robinson was arrested in June of 2000 and was eventually convicted of murder in Kansas and Missouri, receiving death sentences in Kansas that remain pending due to the lengthy appeals process in capital cases. Robinson's Illinois roots are deeply relevant to understanding his trajectory. His early career of fraud and manipulation in the Chicago area established the patterns and the confidence in his own ability to deceive that sustained his criminal career for 4 decades. He is a figure who illustrates with particular clarity the way in which the skills of a con man and the psychology of a predator can be combined in a single individual to devastating effect. Number 8. Silas Jane, the horse world killer and the dark side of Illinois' equestrian elite. The world of competitive show horses seems, on the surface, an unlikely setting for organized crime and murder, but the story of Silas Jane demonstrates that predatory violence and ruthless criminal organization can take root in the most unexpected environments. Jane was born in 1907 and grew up in the horse country of the Chicago suburbs, an environment in which wealth, competition, and the particular social dynamics of the equestrian world created a culture that he navigated with a combination of genuine skill and complete ethical vacancy. He became one of the most prominent figures in the Illinois horse trading and show horse business, operating a series of stables in the Chicago suburbs and building a reputation that was simultaneously admired for his knowledge and feared for his willingness to use any means necessary to protect his business interests. The story of Silas Jane's crimes is inextricably bound up with his relationship with his brother George Jane, a rivalry so intense and so bitter that it ultimately produced a murder-for-hire plot that sent Silas to prison and left a family permanently destroyed. The two brothers had competed against each other in the horse business for decades, a competition that Silas increasingly viewed as a zero-sum war that George was winning. By the late 1960s, Silas had decided that the only satisfactory resolution was his brother's death, and he began organizing a conspiracy to commit murder with the same ruthless practicality he applied to his horse business. On October 28, 1970, George Jane was shot and killed outside his home in Inverness, Illinois, in a murder that investigators immediately suspected was connected to the family's long-running feud. The investigation of George Jane's murder took years and involved deep penetration of the criminal networks that Silas Jane had developed over decades of operating on the margins of legality in the horse world. Silas Jane was eventually convicted of murder conspiracy in 1973 and sentenced to 6 to 20 years in prison. He served approximately 6 years before being paroled in 1979, and the brevity of his sentence relative to the gravity of his crime was a source of considerable public frustration. But Silas Jane's criminal history was not limited to his brother's murder. He was also connected to a series of barn fires, arsons committed against competitors and enemies in the horse world, that resulted in the deaths of horses and, in at least one case, threatened human lives. And he was linked by investigators to a much larger and more disturbing criminal network in the Chicago suburban horse world that involved insurance fraud on a massive scale and a culture of intimidation and violence that had operated for years beneath the respectable surface of the show horse community. Silas Jane died in 1987, having outlived his sentence and returned to a semblance of normal life in his final years. His story, while less focused on the direct serial violence that characterizes most entries on this list, belongs here because it represents a species of organized predatory criminality that is in some ways more chilling than the solitary killer, the deliberate, calculated organization of murder as a business solution, conducted by a man deeply embedded in a legitimate and respected community. The Jane case also produced a remarkable investigative legacy. The barn fires and related crimes connected to the Illinois horse world were investigated by a task force that included ATF agents and eventually produced convictions against multiple individuals. And the investigation surfaced connections to organized crime that suggested the corruption of the equestrian world in the Chicago suburbs was far deeper and more systemic than any single family feud. Number 9. Chester Weger, the starved rock killer and Illinois' longest-serving prisoner. On March 14, 1960, 3 women from the Chicago suburb of Riverside went hiking in Starved Rock State Park, one of Illinois' most beautiful and beloved natural areas, a place of dramatic sandstone canyons, ancient river views, and the kind of serene natural grandeur that draws visitors from across the state. Lois Friedgood, 46, Mildred Lindquist, 50, and Frances Murphy, 50, were friends and members of a local bridge club who had planned the outing as a pleasant late winter excursion. They were experienced visitors to the park and had every reason to expect an ordinary day in a safe and familiar place. They were never seen alive again. Their bodies were found 2 days later in St. Louis Canyon, one of the park's most scenic spots, beaten to death with a tree branch. The brutality of the murders, the apparent randomness of the attack, and the stunning setting combined to make the Starved Rock murders one of the most sensational criminal cases in Illinois history, a case that attracted national attention and produced an investigation of enormous scope. The man eventually convicted of the murders was Chester Weger, a 21-year-old dishwasher at the Parks Lodge who had been employed there for several years and who lived with his wife and children in a cabin on the park grounds. Weger initially cooperated with investigators, submitting to questioning and presenting himself as a helpful witness. But his behavior under interrogation was inconsistent. His explanations for his whereabouts on the day of the murders did not hold up under scrutiny and physical evidence. Rope fibers found in Weger's jacket that matched rope used to bind the victims pointed directly at him. Weger was arrested in November of 1960, approximately 8 months after the murders, and he confessed to the crimes on November 22, 1960. He subsequently recanted the confession, claiming it had been coerced, and this recantation became the foundation of a legal battle that has continued, in various forms, for more than 60 years. Weger was tried in early 1961, convicted of 1 count of murder, and sentenced to life in prison. He has been incarcerated ever since, making him, for much of the latter part of his imprisonment, the longest-serving prisoner in Illinois history. Over the decades, Weger has maintained his innocence with remarkable persistence, appearing before parole boards numerous times and consistently being denied release. His case has attracted the attention of journalists, documentary filmmakers, and legal advocates who have examined the evidence and raised questions about the reliability of the physical evidence and the circumstances of the confession. In 2020, Weger was again denied parole, with the board citing the severity of the crime and Weger's continued denial of guilt as factors in their decision. The Starved Rock case is significant in Illinois criminal history not only for its sensational elements, but for the questions it raises about the long-term administration of justice. If Weger is guilty, and the weight of the evidence, including the physical evidence and the original confession, suggests to most serious analysts that he is, then his decades of imprisonment represent a proportionate response to one of the most brutal crimes in Illinois history. If there is any credible doubt about his guilt, then his case represents one of the most prolonged potential miscarriages of justice in the state's history. The case has never been definitively resolved to everyone's satisfaction, and it continues to be the subject of active debate among true crime researchers, legal scholars, and the people of Illinois. Number 10. Michael Swango, the poisoning doctor who killed patients under the cover of medical care. There is a particular species of horror reserved for crimes committed by those in whom we have placed our greatest trust: the teachers, the clergy, the caregivers, the healers, and among all of these categories of betrayed trust, perhaps the most viscerally disturbing is the doctor who kills. Michael Swango is the most documented and confirmed example of this phenomenon in American history, a physician who used the access and authority granted by his medical credentials to murder patients, and, before he was a doctor, coworkers and acquaintances, with a casualness and apparent pleasure that investigators and forensic psychologists have struggled to fully explain. Swango was born on October 21, 1954, in Tacoma, Washington, and he moved with his family to Illinois as a child, eventually growing up in Quincy in western Illinois. His father was an Army officer who was frequently absent. His mother was an alcoholic, and his childhood was by various accounts marked by isolation, social difficulty, and an interior life that he kept carefully hidden from those around him. He was, nonetheless, a high-achieving student, a Marine Corps veteran, and a graduate of Southern Illinois University before he entered the medical program at Southern Illinois University School of Medicine, and then completed his residency training at Ohio State University Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio. It was during his residency at Ohio State that the first documented pattern of suspicious patient deaths associated with Swango emerged. Multiple patients on wards where Swango worked died unexpectedly, and at least one nurse, Carolyn Beery, observed Swango injecting something into a patient who subsequently died and reported her observations to supervisors. Despite these reports, which should have triggered a serious investigation, the medical center's response was inadequate. Swango was not reported to law enforcement. The suspicious deaths were not thoroughly investigated, and he was allowed to complete his residency and obtain his medical degree. The institutional failure here is staggering and reflects a broader problem in medicine of that era, in which the profession's culture of internal loyalty and resistance to external scrutiny created an environment where dangerous practitioners could be protected rather than exposed. After completing his residency, Swango returned to Illinois and worked briefly as an emergency medical technician in Adams County, where he poisoned at least 6 colleagues with arsenic-laced food, causing serious illness in all of them. He was caught when investigators found arsenic in his possession and confirmed the poisoning, and he was convicted in August of 1985 of aggravated battery. Notably, not attempted murder, a charging decision that would have serious consequences, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He served 2 years and was released in 1987. What happened next is one of the most shocking chapters in the history of medical licensing in the United States. Despite his conviction, despite the pattern of suspicious deaths at Ohio State, and despite the concerns documented in his professional file, Swango managed over the following years to obtain medical credentials and employment at hospitals in multiple states and eventually in other countries, using falsified applications, forged documents, and a willingness to move quickly when suspicion began to develop. He worked at institutions in Virginia, South Dakota, New York, and eventually in Zimbabwe and Zambia, where he is believed to have killed patients at hospitals in both countries before international investigators finally closed in. Swango was arrested in 1997 at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport as he attempted to board a flight to Saudi Arabia, where he had arranged a medical position. He was initially prosecuted on federal fraud charges related to his falsified applications, and it was through the investigation of those fraud charges that the full scope of his patient murders began to emerge. He was eventually charged with and pleaded guilty to 3 murders in New York and to the use of a weapon of mass destruction in a federal indictment that reflected the government's determination to ensure he would never again have access to patients. He was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole in 2000, a sentence he is currently serving at a federal correctional facility. The confirmed victim count for Swango is generally cited as at least 4, with the number he may actually have killed estimated by some investigators at 60 or more, a figure that places him among the most prolific medical killers in history if accurate. The uncertainty about the full scope of his crimes is itself a product of the institutional failures that allowed him to operate. When a doctor kills and kills across multiple institutions in multiple countries, and when those institutions are reluctant to examine their records or acknowledge what may have happened on their wards, the true number of victims may never be known. Michael Swango's case led directly to significant reforms in medical licensing, including the creation of national databases that make it more difficult for physicians with criminal histories to obtain credentials in new states by falsifying their applications. The National Practitioner Data Bank, which had been created in 1986, was significantly strengthened as a result of cases like Swango's, and the case is still taught in medical ethics courses as perhaps the clearest possible example of what can happen when a profession's internal culture of protection and discretion overrides the obligation to protect patients. For the families of those he killed, the sentence Swango received, life without parole, provides a form of finality, but the knowledge that he operated for so long in so many places and with so many opportunities for the system to stop him and failed each time is a pain that no sentence can fully address. He remains incarcerated, having made no public statements expressing remorse for his crimes, and the patients who trusted him with their lives in hospitals in Illinois, Ohio, New York, and across Africa paid for the system's failures with everything they had.